Almost as soon as the election results became clear last May, we heard calls from the new leadership to postpone the December 2022 Barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan elections. The rationalization they offered was cost savings. Postponing the elections, which had already been postponed once, would save the government billions of pesos that can be used for the pandemic response, they said. It has since become clear that the government will in fact spend more if the barangay and SK elections are again postponed. But on October 10, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed Republic Act 11935 into law. Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are in the public square. Famed election lawyer, attorney Romulo Macalintal, petitioned the Supreme Court on October 17 to, in layman's terms, stop the postponement of the elections. The court agreed to hear oral arguments right away and set them for October 21. This is potentially a landmark case, the first to question Congress's practice of postponing barangay elections, the newest to define the true role of barangay elections and thus of the barangay as a unit of government. Will the Supreme Court stop Congress? We are joined tonight by two esteemed lawyers whose insightful views I respect and always look forward to reading. Attorney Oliver Xavier Reyes is professorial lecturer at the University of the Philippines, College of Law, and two other universities. And former Comelec Chief of Staff Attorney Emil Maranon III is a prominent election lawyer. Thank you, Attorney Reyes and Attorney Maranon, for joining us in the public square.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Good evening, Attorney Emil.
Hi, Sir Oli.
Thank you, Sir Oli. Attorney Reyes, my first question for you is, I gave a layman's summary of what the case is all about. Can you give us your own summary? What is at stake in this petition before the Supreme Court?
Well, firstly, it's obviously a novel question. As I think, as you mentioned, this practice has been done before, but it has never really been, as far as we know, challenged before the Supreme Court. If it has not been dealt with in a full-blown decision by the Supreme Court. I think it's quite telling, actually, that the Supreme Court almost quite immediately decided to hold oral arguments. And I don't think it's just because the expiration of the terms is looming, but I think it also does give an indication that the Supreme Court is quite seriously considering the issues that are raised here. So I think that they do recognize the novelty of the question involved. It involves a provision, I think, of the Constitution that has never really been, as far as I know, meaningfully interpreted, and that is the fact that while all elected officials, senators, congressmen, members of Congress, the president, their terms are fixed by the Constitution. The same is not true with respect to barangay officials as well as SK officials. And the Constitution is explicit in saying that it is Congress who defines their terms.
Thank you. I think Attorney Romy Mac makes a distinction between the barangay elections and the SK elections. So his petition is really just for the barangay elections.
In fact, it's quite
law covers SK. Yeah, so go ahead, Attorney.
I was just saying that I found it interesting that the Constitution actually mentions barangay, the word barangay several times, implying that this is indeed one of the offices that is recognized and somehow has a role under the Constitution. But as to the precise functions, as to the term, that's left entirely up to Congress. In contrast, the Sangguniang Kabataan, there's no mention of it in the Constitution. It is a creature entirely of Congress. I mean, it's entirely created by law.
Thank you. Attorney Emil, the petition itself says that it is the first time to raise this question of the constitutionality of the postponement of the elections. Is it in fact the first time that such a postponement is being questioned before the Supreme Court? There have been other postponements before. Were there previous legal challenges before?
Parang wala ako actually maisip na case where the Supreme Court has actually decided on the issue whether or not the date of the election or barangay election can be moved or postponed to another date. So wala akong maisip na decision, and this is precisely the reason why there's actually a necessity for this case to be resolved by the Supreme Court, particularly resolving yung issues that, right, for example, whether or not pwede ka bang mag-move ng date ng election. And for me, the more important issue is whether or not as a result of the postponement or yung pag-move ng date ng election, pwede bang magkaroon ng holdover capacity, for example, yung isang elected barangay official beyond doon sa term limit na binigay sa kanya ng tao or beyond doon sa mandato na binigay sa kanya ng tao. So I think these are very important issues that should require actually the guidance in the ruling of the Supreme Court.
In fact, our current crop of barangay officials are already overstaying. The election was supposed to have been in 2021 in May, if I'm not mistaken. So they've been extended in their positions for over a year. So the new law extends the extension to October of next year. For both Attorney Oli and Attorney Emil, Attorney Romy Mac has about 5 or 6 arguments that he raises before the Supreme Court. Attorney Oli first and Attorney Emil, what do you think, in your view, is the most powerful or persuasive of the arguments that he raises?
I think for me, the most consequential argument that he raises pertains to the definition of the right of suffrage, and that is this postponement and virtual extension and the actual extension of terms of the barangay officials contravenes the exercise by the sovereign people of the right to suffrage. I do think that because at the heart here, it's a clash of two rights, I think. It's the right of Congress under the Constitution to determine the terms of office of barangay officials, and that's part of we can say that's part of the plenary power of Congress, versus the right of suffrage that we, the people, as sovereigns, in fact, our right to choose our elected representatives who will exercise for us the acts of government.
Thank you. Attorney Emil, for you, what would be the most powerful or persuasive argument that Attorney Mac raises?
I think ang pinaka-importante for me na issue or perhaps yung pinaka-mabigat na issue na niraise ni Attorney Macalintal, who is a good friend of mine, is of course yung question of whether or not meron pang konsepto ng holdover yung isang elected official. So ibig sabihin beyond ang term ng office ba, pwede ba silang mag-extend ng authority or pagkakaupo bilang barangay officials beyond doon sa mandate na binigay ng tao. I think yan yung pinaka-importante because I think to a certain extent medyo papalit-palit, free-flopping yung Supreme Court as to whether or not meron pang holdover capacity or wala. So medyo confusing for us. So I think napaka-importante na i-resolve ng Supreme Court yung issue ng holdover. Because remember, when you postpone or when you move the date of the election, the unavoidable consequence yan is may question as to the period wherein from the expiration of the term hanggang doon sa extended period, in what capacity na justify yung pagkakaupo ng isang barangay official. So may sinasabi na holdover capacity, but the question is, meron ba talagang konsepto ng holdover capacity under our Constitution? So I think that this is a very important issue. I think napakabigat na dapat ma-resolve ng Supreme Court.
Attorney Oli, as a layman, I'm struck by the choice of the petitioner to offer us his first argument, essentially the argument of usurpation of power. No? He's saying that the power or the responsibility to postpone elections is with the Comelec. It is not the responsibility of Congress to postpone or to cancel elections. And he said the responsibility of Congress is to fix the term, and then after that, bitaw na sila. No? May I have your thoughts on this particular argument?
I have a somewhat nuanced view on that argument. I do agree that the Constitution generally allocates to the Comelec, as Attorney Macalintal said, the plenary power over elections.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if the Constitution does allocate a role to another entity, to a branch of government such as Congress, and then I think that perhaps that should be read as that could be read as a limitation on this general plenary power. The fact that the plenary power is further defined by a law such as the Omnibus Election Code.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, Congress changed the terms, allowed the officials to hold over, also by law. So, and of course, a subsequent law can always amend the prior law. So, and I think I'm also struck by, because like before, the Comelec under the Constitution has some ample power to regulate expression, for example, in the context of election contest. But the existence of that power has never really been read by the Supreme Court as an exception, for example, to the freedom of expression clause. So I'm not. I think that just the fact that Comelec has a role, Comelec has constitutional powers. I'm not sure that would be sufficient to yield to, especially if and I think the reflexive attitude here of, if you of the courts would just be to uphold the plenary power of Congress. I think it might have to be sourced to a even more fundamental right, and that's why I was drawn to the argument on the right to suffrage.
Attorney Oli, would it be fair to characterize the legal strategy that a petitioner has in filing a case before the Supreme Court of gathering as many possible arguments
Of course.
as there are, and then
and not only that, I think it's his approach, especially in leading off with the argument of the power of the Comelec. It's a rather conservative approach, and it would be an approach that would that could attract, or that could be more attractive if the court does not want to be overly creative or overly liberal, so to speak. I mean, it's a fairly, it's a intermediate step, just limiting a ruling to affirming the power of the Comelec without creating or involving a more substantive, or the declaration of a more substantive right that may also have some unintended consequences in the future.
Attorney Emil, is there another possible ground that the petitioner could have used? If you were to file this case, for instance, what would your main argument be?
Mula noon, I'm very tempted actually to raise the issue as regards from human rights based yung perspective. Actually, for example, part ng ating human rights for na part yung right to a periodic and right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So ibig sabihin yan, it's a potential issue as well, because remember, it's part of our civil and political rights na naging parte ang Pilipinas of that convention. So in other
unfortunately, we seem to be having connection problems with Attorney Emil, who's making a nuanced argument. Attorney Emil, sorry, we lost you there for about 30 seconds. So you were saying that you would like to argue also from the point of view of civil and political rights or human rights that uh, postponing the elections violates those rights.
Yes, I think it's a very good issue na dapat ma-resolve ng Supreme Court because of course apart from the Constitution, apart from our statutes, there's another dimension to this which is international law na naging parte din tayo ng convention na yon. So from that perspective, it's another matter that we need to take into account. And of course, if you were to observe the 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 line of decisions of the Supreme Court pagdating sa eleksyon, bihirang-bihira na pinag-uusapan yung perspective ng human rights. Because ako kasi medyo rights-based yung approach ko sa elections. Na this is not just a political or civil exercise, but rather this is a human right. So this is something that you cannot just change or deprive. One example, for example, concrete example, merong mga kabataan, for example, na eligible to run for SK this 2022, but pagdating ng next year, overage na sila. So, ibig sabihin po niyan, pag minove mo yung election by 1 year, they will be deprived of their right to run for public office. So can you imagine yung isang yung ilang taon, gaano ba kadami yung kabataan sa ganung edad na ma-deprive ng karapatan na yon. So for me, apart from constitutional, statutory issues, I think this is something, a new lens that na kailangan tingnan din ng Supreme Court.
I think that's very interesting. It's like making a lost generation argument. No? There's a generation of 1 to 2 million youths who lose their chance to run for the SK because of the postponement. Very interesting. Attorney Emil, you spent 4 or 5 years as Chief of Staff of Comelec Chair Brillantes. The incumbent Comelec Chair now, George Garcia, has given very encouraging, very positive statements in the wake of the filing of this petition. He says that yes, this is something that maybe the Supreme Court should finally decide, and so on. Is this something that is just par for the course, something that a Comelec Chair would say, or can we read more into Chair George Garcia's statements?
Actually, yung naiipit sa issue actually ng postponement is yung Comelec, because remember, they are actually obliged to actually follow the law. So pag pinuspone ng Kongreso, ibig sabihin on their part, dapat stop na rin sila in terms of preparation. But with the case filed before the Supreme Court, so lumalabas na may possibility, kumbaga 50-50, baka matuloy, baka hindi matuloy. In fact, based doon sa mga Facebook post ng mga kaibigan ko from Comelec, all of them are saying na parang confused sila, ano ba, matutuloy or hindi. Because remember, this is not a matter of simple as whether mag-hold ka ng election or hindi, but may preparasyon to eh. You have to print ballots, you have to transport ballots, and you have to train teachers, and lahat nito may cost component to. So for example, pag nag-train ka ng teacher tapos eventually hindi magagamit this year, by the next year magti-train ka uli, so magdodoble yung gastos mo. So from the point of view of Comelec, while they are, for example, duty-bound to actually comply with the postponement na ginawa ng Kongreso, but at the same time, because of this case, medyo merong confusion whether itutuloy or hindi. So, in a way, nakakaawa din yung Comelec sa ganitong sitwasyon. So,
I think that makes it easier for us to understand, no, what Chair Garcia has been saying, and a few others also, that there are no cost savings here. In fact, you are looking at adding to the costs. At this point, there are already sunk costs, right? 2 months before the scheduled election, there are already sunk costs which you cannot recover.
Yes.
You're saying
in fact, paulit-ulit ko sinasabi na, in fact, sa past articles ko sa Rappler, sinasabi ko naman na yung date of the election, foreseeable naman yan. That is why hindi ko maintindihan why do they have to postpone it last minute kung kailan na nagsisimula na yung cycle of preparation ng Comelec, saka ipo-postpone? For example, alam ng lahat na 2022 may election, bakit hindi pinospone 2 years ago or a year ago? Bakit kailangan i-postpone few months before the elections? So in a way, parang yun yung hindi ko maintindihan kung bakit year in and year out, ganun parati ang nangyayari. Kung kailan malapit na yung eleksyon, saka magde-decide na magpo-postpone. Bakit hindi ito i-postpone? If ever na gusto nilang i-postpone way beforehand para ni Singkong Duling walang gastos ng Comelec. So I think Congress, on the part of Congress, dapat sana matutunan rin nila na yung tatawag ba foresight, na maawa naman kayo sa Comelec, kumbaga na wag niyo naman bigyan ng sakit ng ulong Comelec because they really have to prepare. And hindi po biro ang mag-prepare sa election. For example, for a barangay election which is manual, usually po ang preparation time yan is 1 year. If we want a really good preparation, kung talagang gusto mo i-shorten, 6 months. But can you imagine kung may news of postponement, tapos may kaso pa, and then everyone is so confused, itutuloy ba or hindi? So, I really hope that in the future, sana ma-decide na mas maaga ng Kongreso yung issue ng postponement na to.
If I read the statistics correctly, in the first 20 or 25 years since EDSA, we've had 3 postponements of the barangay elections. But in the last 5 years, including the most recent one, we've had 4 postponements. Attorney Oli, sorry, this is not strictly a legal question, but more of a political question. So I don't know if you would like to answer this, but let me just direct Attorney Emil's question to you. No? Why decide so late in the day, or actually at the start of the new administration, to postpone the elections? What could the benefits be for those who decide to postpone it?
Well, the only benefits that I see really are the benefits that are given to these incumbents because they get to stay on. And I cannot think of, that in itself should be a cause of concern. And I think that especially the Supreme Court should definitely consider all of the practical considerations that Attorney Emil had mentioned. And also the justification that apparently has been given for the postponement. The fact that supposedly walang pondo or kulang ang pondo. And I think if even assuming that the validity of that justification, I think it ought to be still balanced against what I was mentioning earlier, the undiluted right of suffrage of the voters. Because I mean it's going to be a terrible precedent if elections can be legally postponed just because there's lack of funds. I mean, just imagine if, for example, let's say the Constitution were amended later on, and the terms of other officials, presidents, senators, is also made dependent on the will of Congress. So that would mean that even under this, if that justification stands, Congress can just exercise the raw power to postpone elections whenever it wants, and just simply say that there's insufficient or no funds to hold them.
For both Attorney Oli and Attorney Emil, what do you make of the distinction that the Constitution itself makes between all the other types of elections, presidential, local, and Senate, legislative, and so on, and which have fixed dates in the Constitution, and the type of elections for the barangay, which is it's left to Congress to determine, and so on. Is that distinction material, or was that a mistake of the framers? Attorney Oli first, and Attorney Emil.
Yeah. No, actually, I suspect that the other national positions as well as local government officials, those are roles that have been, that essentially are coterminous with the Philippine Republic itself. Mm-hmm. But the barangay as a political unit, this only occurred in the 1970s, during the first President Marcos. And who knows, maybe the framers of the 1987 Constitution were not really since there has been no long-standing tradition of the barangay as a political unit, they may have even been ambivalent about the barangay and wanted to leave the option, for example, for maybe even Congress should do as it wishes with that barangay. But at the same time, it still is a political office. It still represents a means by which the people are able to govern themselves through their elected representatives. So I think that ultimately, the role of barangay officials should be seen in a similar fashion as other political officials, if only because of that bare symbolism.
Thank you. Attorney Emil, your thoughts on this?
I think yung reason is that I think before ang term of office, I think ng barangay officials, 5 years. So unlike other local government officials na 3 years, so medyo ambivalent kung whether 3 years or 5 years, but later on naging 3 years na lang. So I think yun yung exception na kumbaga hindi siya pwedeng mapareho with other local government officials. So yung kaya bigyan ng discretion yung Congress because traditionally mas mahaba ang term of office ng barangay officials as against, let's say, ordinary local government officials. So yun yung nakikita ko lang logic behind it.
Attorney Emil, when you were in the Comelec, Chair Brillantes, among other reforms, tried to purge the party list system, but was ultimately denied by the Supreme Court. My question has to do with, is it really reasonable for us to expect some reform coming from the Supreme Court? Of course, the circumstances have changed and so on, but the petition before the Supreme Court now is asking for the Supreme Court to actually tell Congress they've been doing it wrong in the last 5 years and also in the last 30 years. Do you think we should put our hopes on the court?
Traditionally kasi ang courts are passive, no? So umaakyat lang umaaksyon ng Korte Suprema pag merong controversy na tinatawag. So in other words, hindi dapat natin inaasa sa Korte Suprema yung usaping reforma sa batas o reforma sa eleksyon. The initiative to reform our election system should come from Congress because remember, if you want to change something, it begins with change doon sa batas mismo. Because remember, if you look at our election system, Congress ang nagpapasa ng batas ng ating election laws, ang Comelec taga-implement lang. So, tapos kung may issue as regards implementation or even issue doon sa batas na pinasa ng Congress, then we go to the Supreme Court. So, kumbaga yung merong active part sa electoral reform, it should be Congress. So, dapat nagsisimula sa Kongreso yung usapin ng reforma, hindi dapat sa Comelec. Although, of course, from the perspective of Comelec, pwede din siyang mag-push ng reform, pwede siyang mag-recommend ng Congress, and sometimes there are batches ng Comelec and Bank na medyo mas active na to a certain extent that they really push the limit of electoral reform, sinasagad na. Because remember, ang ating omnibus election law is still 1985. So can you imagine, na-automate na yung ating election pero yung ating omnibus code is still circa 1985. So kumbaga, merong mismatch between the technology and the present reality doon sa batas natin. So Comelec is really forced to invent, to actually be creative kung paano niya i-implement yung election laws natin. That is why if really want a smooth na election laws na walang conflict, walang confusion, dapat nagsisimula ang usapin ng reforma sa Kongreso.
Thank you. Attorney Oli, there's another argument that the petitioner raised, which to my layman's mind, I did not know it was possible to argue that. I think Attorney Emil referenced that in passing. No? The argument that the term of I guess the subordinate office like barangay cannot be longer than those of the appointing power. No? So if 3 years yung Congress, dapat hindi sosobra sa 3 years. Is there in fact a principle like that? And how do you think that argument will be received by the court?
I think that that argument may yield, especially if if the Supreme Court is going to be deferential, even if only up to a point, to the power of Congress, insofar as determining the terms of barangay officials are concerned. Because I mean, that argument extended by its logic might also extend to us. If Congress, for example, wanted to impose or create an office that has a term that would survive the Congress that created it, then more than 5 years, 7 years, and perhaps even the choice is made to attribute a longer term in order to give that office some independence and insulate it from politics. Even those particular limits may be put at risk, I think. But I do think that this particular time, it's really going to depend on how deferential is the Supreme Court willing to be on this right of Congress that apparently is in the Constitution.
Attorney Emil, is it possible for the Supreme Court, because of the nature of the petition, making a distinction between the barangay elections from the SK elections, is it possible for the Supreme Court to say, okay, the barangay elections can push through, but the SK can be postponed until October? Is that within the realm of possibility?
Pwede din, pero I think mahirap because ang question niyan, pwede bang separate yung separable ba, for example, sa batas yung topic doon sa barangay election, postponement, at saka doon sa SK. But from operations perspective, kasi magkaiba naman yung botante ng SK. Pangalawa, iba rin yung balota ng SK voters. So kumbaga, in terms of operations, pwede naman talagang hatiin kasi after all magkaibang eleksyon naman yan. So it's really possible, but of course from basic principle naman ng litigation, hindi ka naman pwedeng mag-rule ang Korte Suprema beyond doon sa nirereklamo or nire-raise na issue. So for example, if yung issue na nire-raise is tungkol lang, for example, sa barangay elections, then hindi mo pwedeng i-touch yung ibang issue na hindi naman ni-raise because yung mga taong dapat apektado ng issue yun, dapat mabigyan din ng due process or karapatang marinig. But unless siguro na inseparable yung issue, for example, ng postponement ng barangay ng SK, then there's a possibility na ma-declare unconstitutional ang lahat. But then again, I share your sentiment, a very interesting yung theory na kung bakit sineperate.
Thank you. Maybe one last question for our two distinguished gentlemen. How do you see this playing out? If the court were to decide in favor of the petitioner, what shape do you think the decision will be? Of course, it's very early to say this, but just as a way to help anticipate what the Supreme Court can do, maybe I can ask you, how do you see the decision playing out? Attorney Oli and then Attorney Emil.
Yeah. I think the easiest thing for the Supreme Court to do, although I do hope they do not treat it so cursorily, is just to deny the petition and just say that Congress has the power. But if the Supreme Court were to grant the petition, I think it's more likely to, rather than subscribe to the theories such as relating to the right of suffrage, I think it's more likely to try to be as conservative as possible, in the sense that it's just going to say that, it's going to say, for example, that There has to be a balance. Well, if Congress exercises this power to, modify terms and perhaps lead to a holdover, there should be judicial review as to the reasons, and perhaps they can just say that the reasons in this case would not warrant a further postponement of barangay elections. It could also, I think that they would want as much as possible to concede that yes, Congress has a role in determining the terms of barangay officials, but it would also, through this petition, impose some limits on how Congress may exercise their power.
Thank you. Attorney Emil?
I share the sentiment ni Attorney Oli, no? So may dalawang possibility, either i-dismiss ang petition, it's the most convenient na pwedeng mangyari because postpone ng eleksyon, tigil ng preparasyon ng Comelec, tahimik yung lahat until the 2023 election. So that's the most convenient way out of this. But it will leave, for example, it will set a precedent, for example, na pwede palang ma-postpone ng Kongreso anytime and however they like yung barangay elections. So it will be at the mercy of Congress. So yun yung consequence niya. Another possibility is, of course, i-grant yung certiorari. But then again, it will put Comelec in a very difficult position because remember, nag-stop na sila ng preparation. Then they will, I don't think that the Supreme Court can come up with a decision like, let's say, in weeks. So I'm pretty sure it will take months before they can come up with a decision. And yung period na yon, for example, na hindi makadesisyon ang Supreme Court, natatanggal yun sa preparatory time dapat ng Comelec kung in case na itutuloy man yung eleksyon. So medyo kawawa yung Comelec if in case na matagalan ng Korte Suprema sa pag-resolve ng issue, di ba, whether constitutional or unconstitutional. But another way of looking at it is there's also possibility na i-declare na unconstitutional. However, the Supreme Court can also say na, but we can only do this like kumbaga prospective yung application, wag muna for purposes na para hindi lang madiskarel ang upcoming 2023 elections. This ruling will take effect after the 2023 elections. It's another possibility. After all, they are the Supreme Court. Whatever they will say, yun naman ifa-follow ng lahat. And this is not the first time actually na merong prospective na ruling ang Supreme Court na kahit sinabi niya na bawal yan or ganyan, but i-apply lang in the future situation. That's also a possibility. In fact, it's a very logical solution if in case they decide to declare the postponement of barangay election as constitutional. But of course, ano lang yan, discussion na to as regards yung course na pwedeng tahakin ng Supreme Court. But as regards the issue, I think I would like to hear more from the parties kung ano sasabihin nila and how they can actually defend their respective positions before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it would be nice to hear the oral arguments on Friday. Attorney,
just something quick to add about options. There's also another option that the Supreme Court will, as prayed for by Attorney Macalintal, they'll grant the TRO to quo order, and even without deciding the case, just let the elections push through. And then when it's ready to decide to come out with a full-blown decision, even if that's after the elections, that's another option the court can take.
I see. Sorry, Attorney Emil, a quick follow-up based on what Attorney Oli said. Operationally, for the Comelec, would a TRO be welcome, even though, let's say, just before the December elections, the court will rule and say, well, no, postponing it to October is fine. In other words, tatakbo uli yung metro and so on.
Correct.
Actually, there are more costs that way. I mean, how would that affect Comelec?
Actually, I find it very unwise if in case na may TRO na may issue. Why? Because remember may utos na ang Comelec na ang pag-print ng ballot papalitan na from 2022 gagawin ng 2023. So kumbaga ang preparasyon nga ng Comelec ngayon is towards the 2023 election. So ang mangyayari kung may TRO, technically walang batas na nagpo-postpone ng election. So ang presumption habang may TRO is tuloy yung election, dapat balik trabaho ang Comelec in preparation for 2022 elections. And when we say balik trabaho ang Comelec in preparation for the 2022 election, ibig sabihin tuloy-tuloy po yung paggastos ng pera, tuloy-tuloy ang training ng teachers, tuloy-tuloy yung printing, and it will put the Comelec in a very difficult situation na they are forced to actually spend billions of pesos in preparation, and then may risk din pala later on na mag-decide ang Supreme Court na ay constitutional pala yung postponement. So it's a very difficult situation because the moment you issue a TRO, it will force Comelec to proceed with its preparation. And kumbaga matatali ang Korte Suprema na sige na nga, decide na lang natin na unconstitutional yan para hindi masayang yung billion-billion na ginastos ng Comelec. So kumbaga, dapat pag-isipan ng Supreme Court yung issue ng TRO, especially na hindi lang to usaping legality but merong usapin dito na yung paggastos ng pera ng bayan, hindi po mura ang pagpapatakbo ng eleksyon at saka yung preparasyon sa eleksyon. Bilyon-bilyon ng usapin dito. Can you imagine, you're just throwing out billions of pesos of taxpayers' money kung in case na kung mali po yung pag-resolve ng Korte Suprema doon sa issue ng paghingi ng TRO.
Wow. Okay. So it's an even more complicated issue than I thought. I mean, potentially a landmark case, but there are also many landmines, so to speak. To Attorney Emil Maranon III and to Attorney Oliver Xavier Reyes, thank you for sharing your time and your insights here in the public square. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for us tonight. The next step for engaged citizens is always to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.